Man rescues a bear cub. But what the mother does next will shock you. The early morning mist clung to the dense pines of Montana's wilderness as John Carter stepped out of his cabin, thermos in hand, the crisp air biting at his face. His routine patrol had become second nature after years as a forest ranger, a solitary job that suited him well. Today seemed no different, quiet, save for the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional bird call. The stillness was why the sound startled him. It wasn't a rustle or a chirp, but a long, desperate cry that seemed to cut through the forest, hanging in the air like a plea. John froze mid-step, his ears straining. The sound came again, softer now, but no less haunting. It wasn't human, though it carried a sorrow that stirred something deep within him. His pulse quickened as he turned toward the direction of the noise, leaving the safety of the marked trail. The sound grew louder as he trekked through the uneven terrain, his boots crunching against frost-tipped leaves. The forest grew denser here, the towering pines obscuring the rising sun, and the dampness in the air seeped through his jacket. He didn't need a map to know he was heading toward the ravine. John hesitated. Experience had taught him to be wary of the unexpected in these woods. Bears, especially in spring, were unpredictable. But as the cry echoed again, weaker this time, he found himself pushing forward despite the warning bells in his mind. Minutes later, he reached the edge of the ravine. Below, partially obscured by mud and broken branches, a bear cub struggled desperately. Its tiny frame was stuck in thick, dark mud, its movements sluggish and panicked. It let out another high-pitched wail, its voice cracking with exhaustion. John's breath caught. A cub meant a mother nearby, and her reaction to his presence would almost certainly be violent. He scanned the area quickly, his heart pounding. The dense foliage and shadows revealed nothing, but that didn't mean she wasn't watching. John's instinct told him to leave, but his conscience fought back. The cub's cries were growing fainter, its struggle weakening as the mud threatened to pull it deeper. He exhaled sharply and muttered to himself, "This is a bad idea, Carter." Grabbing the coil of rope from his pack, he tied it to a sturdy pine tree and anchored it firmly. The descent was slow and deliberate. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the rope, the crunch of loose gravel beneath his boots, the distant rush of water in the ravine stream. As he neared the bottom, the cub's eyes locked onto him. Its cries stopped, replaced by labored breathing, as if it recognized that help was near. John kept his movements careful, his voice low and soothing, though he doubted the cub could understand him. "Easy now, I'm not here to hurt you." As he crouched near the cub, the mud sucked at his boots. He reached into his pack for a sturdy stick to use as leverage. Before he could begin, a low, rumbling growl froze him in place. Slowly, John lifted his head and saw her. The mother bear stood just above the ravine, her massive frame partially obscured by the shadows. Her fur bristled, and her amber eyes locked onto him, filled with a mixture of suspicion and raw, protective fury. John's breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at him to abandon the cub and retreat, but the mud encasing its small body left no room for hesitation. He forced himself to stay calm, his movements deliberate as he returned his focus to the cub. The mother bear stepped closer to the edge, growling low but not charging. John glanced up, meeting her gaze. "I'm trying to help," he murmured, his voice steady but soft, though he doubted she cared for explanations. Then, something he didn't expect happened. The growl softened, replaced by a deep, rumbling huff. The bear backed up slightly, her movements hesitant. John's brow furrowed in confusion, but he didn't dare question it. Instead, he used the moment to wedge the stick beneath the cub and began carefully prying it loose. The mud was thick, clinging stubbornly to its fur, but he made slow progress, speaking in soft tones as he worked. Above him, the mother bear moved again. John tensed, expecting aggression, but instead she began pawing at the ground, her actions deliberate. She disappeared briefly into the trees, and when she returned, she carried a branch in her jaws. Dropping it near the edge, she huffed again. John blinked in disbelief. Was she helping? He shook his head, unsure whether he was imagining things, but there was no mistaking the intent. The bear retrieved another branch, dropping it near the ravine before stepping back, watching him intently. Fueled by the surreal cooperation, John worked faster. Mud and cold water seeped into his gloves, but he ignored the discomfort. After what felt like an eternity, the cub's front legs were free, and with one final effort, John managed to lift its small body onto the drier ground. The cub lay there panting, too weak to move but visibly relieved. John stepped back cautiously, keeping his hands raised and his gaze averted from the mother bear. She descended the slope slowly, her massive paws crunching against loose stones. John froze as she approached the cub, sniffing it carefully before nudging it upright. The cub let out a soft cry, and the mother licked its matted fur in response, her posture radiating calmness rather than hostility. John began his retreat, his pulse still racing, his mind struggling to process the encounter. As he reached the rope, he glanced back one final time. The mother bear's eyes met his again, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something in them. Acknowledgement, perhaps even gratitude. He climbed out of the ravine, his legs trembling slightly from the effort and adrenaline. Once at the top, he untied the rope, slinging it over his shoulder. The bears were already retreating into the forest, the cub stumbling slightly but supported by its mother's gentle nudges. Standing alone in the now quiet wilderness, John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The forest seemed unchanged, indifferent to the extraordinary moment that had just unfolded. As he began the walk back to his cabin, his thoughts churned with questions. Was it possible that the mother bear understood his intentions? Could animals perceive and cooperate in ways humans had yet to comprehend? He shook his head, unable to settle on an answer, but certain of one thing. Today had changed something in him. The wilderness, once a place of clear-cut rules and predictable dangers, now felt layered with mysteries he had barely begun to uncover. The days that followed the encounter in the ravine were marked by an unshakable sense of disquiet for John Carter. He went about his usual tasks, checking trails, inspecting wildlife habitats, and monitoring the seasonal changes in the forest. But his mind kept circling back to the mother bear and her cub. The memory of her intelligent, almost deliberate actions refused to fade. He had seen countless animals during his years as a ranger, but none had ever defied the natural script like she had. Cooperation, trust, understanding. These were qualities he would never have associated with a grizzly, and yet they were exactly what he had witnessed. The encounter had left a deep impression, not just on his professional instincts, but on something more personal, something he struggled to name. It was 3 mornings later, just as dawn began to creep through the tree line, that John noticed the first sign that the bears had not forgotten him either. He stepped outside his cabin, the air crisp and cold, with faint tendrils of mist rising from the nearby creek. The frost crunched underfoot as he made his way to his woodpile, planning to split some logs for the day's heating. But his stride faltered when he saw the pile. Strewn among the neatly stacked wood were several thick branches, freshly broken and out of place. At first, he thought the wind had knocked them down, but the peculiar arrangement suggested otherwise. They were laid with almost deliberate care, and some of the bark was stripped away, exposing the pale wood underneath. His gaze shifted to the ground, and his stomach tightened when he saw the unmistakable prints leading up to the pile. Massive paw marks, clear and sharp in the frost. A mother bear and a smaller set beside it. The bears had been here. John crouched to examine the prints more closely, running his gloved hand over the edges. They were fresh, likely no more than an hour old, and they led back into the dense woods beyond his cabin. His mind raced. Why would she come here? Was she searching for food, or could it be something else? The thought felt absurd even as it crossed his mind, but the more he stared at the branches, the more he was convinced they were meant to be something. A gesture, though of what he couldn't be sure. He stood, his pulse quickening as he scanned the tree line, half expecting to see her massive silhouette watching from the shadows. The forest remained still, the only sound the soft rustling of wind through the pines. Shaking off the unease, John gathered the branches and set them aside, deciding to treat them as a coincidence for now. But the bears were not done with him. Over the next week, their visits became more frequent and more deliberate. Each time, John awoke to find evidence of their presence. A pile of smooth stones near his porch, a cluster of wild berries laid neatly on the stump outside his cabin. Even the remains of a small fish left beside his boots one morning. The gifts were strange, almost ritualistic, and they left John both fascinated and unnerved. He told no one about the visits, knowing full well how the story would sound. A bear delivering offerings? It was the kind of tale that would invite ridicule, not understanding. Still, he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. These weren't random acts of scavenging. There was purpose here, though he could only guess at its meaning. One afternoon, as he returned from patrolling a nearby trail, he found himself drawn to the edge of the woods where the prints often appeared. Slinging his pack over his shoulder, he stepped off the path and followed a faint trail that led deeper into the forest. The light dimmed as the trees thickened, their branches forming a canopy that blocked much of the sun. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp, earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. John moved slowly, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Confirmation, perhaps, that the bears were as curious about him as he was about them. The trail led him to a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. In the center stood a gnarled old tree, its roots exposed and tangled like the fingers of an ancient hand. There, near the base of the tree, he saw them. The mother bear stood with her cub, their forms half obscured by the shadows. She was watching him, her massive head tilted slightly, her amber eyes calm but alert. The cub clung to her side, its fur still showing patches of dried mud from the ravine. John stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, neither moved. It was a strange standoff, filled not with tension but with an unspoken understanding. He could feel it in the air, a silent thread connecting them. Then slowly the mother bear turned and began to move. She didn't flee into the forest as he expected, but walked deliberately toward the edge of the clearing, pausing to glance back at him. Her cub followed, stumbling slightly on the uneven ground. John hesitated, unsure whether to follow. The rational part of his mind screamed at him to stay put, to let the bears disappear into the safety of the woods. But another part, the part that had driven him to save the cub days earlier, urged him forward. He took a cautious step, then another, following at a respectful distance. The bears led him deeper into the forest, their pace slow and steady. John noted how the mother bear occasionally stopped to check on her cub, nuzzling it gently before continuing. It was a display of maternal care that felt almost human in its tenderness. After several minutes, they reached a small stream, its water clear and cold as it trickled over smooth stones. The mother bear stopped here, turning to face John. She stood still, her massive frame dwarfing her surroundings, but her posture was neither aggressive nor defensive. It was open. John remained where he was, watching as the bear dipped her head to the water, drinking deeply before nudging her cub to do the same. He felt like an intruder, yet there was no hostility in her actions. If anything, it felt like an invitation, an acknowledgement of shared space. He crouched by the stream, cupping his hands to drink, his eyes never leaving the bears. They lingered for a while, the quiet broken only by the soft sounds of flowing water and the occasional rustle of leaves. When the mother bear finally turned to leave, she did so without haste, her cub trailing close behind. John remained by the stream, watching their forms disappear into the forest until they were nothing more than shadows. As he rose and began his walk back to the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had just happened. The forest seemed different now, as if it held secrets he had only begun to glimpse. For the first time in years, John felt truly connected to the wilderness, not as a protector or observer, but as part of its vast, intricate web. Winter arrived with a sudden, brutal ferocity that Montana's wilderness seemed to unleash only on its most isolated corners. The first storm of the season barreled in overnight, blanketing the forest in snow so thick it muffled every sound. John Carter woke to a cabin cloaked in silence, the kind that spoke of temperatures so low even the trees seemed to shiver. The thermometer outside his window read 10 degrees below zero, and the frost creeping along the glass hinted it would drop further by nightfall. He lit his wood stove, the crackling flames a small comfort against the frigid dawn, and poured himself a cup of coffee, his breath fogging in the icy air that lingered near the floor. As he sipped, his thoughts wandered to the bears. He hadn't seen them since the final encounter by the stream weeks ago, but their absence was unsurprising. By now they would be denning, curled tightly in some hidden corner of the forest, conserving energy against the cold that could strip life away with merciless ease. Still, a faint unease tugged at him. The mother bear had been leaner than he'd expected for this time of year, and her cub still small, both likely struggling to recover from the ordeal in the ravine. He pushed the thought aside. Bears had survived far harsher winters long before humans set foot in these woods. Surely they would endure this one too. By late afternoon, the storm intensified, howling winds sweeping across the landscape and bearing the trails John normally used to patrol. He spent the day chopping wood, checking his emergency supplies, and reinforcing the cabin's shutters against the relentless gusts. Darkness came early, swallowing the forest in shadows as snow continued to fall in heavy, swirling curtains. The wind rattled the windows, and the sharp crack of a distant tree splitting under the weight of ice made him pause mid-stride, his ears straining against the storm's roar. It was while he stood there, listening to the wildness outside, that he heard it, a faint, rhythmic thud, almost imperceptible beneath the howl of the wind. He froze, heart quickening as the sound came again, louder this time, and unmistakably deliberate. Someone or something was knocking on his door. He grabbed his flashlight and rifle, stepping cautiously toward the door. The beam of light cut through the gloom as he eased the door open, the bitter wind slamming into him like a living thing. What he saw froze him in place. Standing on his porch, framed by the swirling snow, was the mother bear. Her fur was matted with frost, her breath rising in thick clouds as she panted heavily. Behind her, huddled against the wall of his cabin, were her two cubs. The smaller of the two barely moved, its body shivering violently, while the larger pressed against its mother's flank, seeking warmth. For a moment, John simply stared, the surreal image refusing to register. Bears didn't act like this. They didn't come to humans for help, didn't approach cabins during storms unless desperation drove them to the brink. And yet here she was, looking up at him with an intensity that felt disturbingly human. The mother bear huffed, her breath fogging the frigid air, and nudged the smallest cub toward the open doorway. John's grip tightened on the doorframe as he grappled with the impossibility of the moment. Everything he knew screamed at him to shut the door, to retreat behind the safety of the walls that separated his world from theirs. Yet he couldn't ignore what he saw. The cub was on the brink of collapse, its breath shallow and erratic, while the mother's eyes seemed to plead with him, a silent, urgent request he couldn't deny. He moved quickly, setting the rifle aside and grabbing his insulated garage key. If he opened the house to them, there would be no controlling the chaos, but the garage offered shelter without the same risks. "Come on," he muttered, motioning for the bear to follow as though she might understand. To his astonishment, she did. The cub stumbled weakly after her as she moved toward the side of the cabin, her massive frame lumbering awkwardly in the snow. He led them to the garage, pushing the door open against a drift of snow that had built up overnight. The inside was dim and cold, but it was dry, and the thick walls would block the worst of the wind. The mother bear entered first, her head swinging from side to side as she inspected the unfamiliar space. The cubs followed, the smaller one collapsing almost immediately onto the concrete floor. John closed the door behind them, sealing out the storm's howl, and crouched by the nearest wall to grab an old tarp. He spread it out near a corner, farthest from his tools and equipment, creating a makeshift bed. "It's not much," he murmured, his voice soft and steady, though his hands trembled from more than the cold. The mother bear guided her cubs onto the tarp, curling her massive body protectively around them. John watched as she licked the smaller cub's face, her tongue moving in slow rhythmic strokes that spoke of both exhaustion and unwavering care. He stepped back, giving them space, and turned to the shelves lining the garage wall. There wasn't much he could offer, but he grabbed a bucket of water and placed it near the tarp, along with an armful of firewood he'd been storing for emergencies. The garage's small propane heater would do little against the freezing temperatures, but it was better than nothing. He lit it carefully, glancing over his shoulder as the mother bear watched him, her amber eyes reflecting the faint glow of the flame. The hours passed in an uneasy quiet. John remained near the door, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, the rifle within reach but untouched. The bears barely moved, their bodies rising and falling in tandem as they dozed fitfully. The storm raged on outside, its fury muffled by the garage's thick walls. John's mind churned as he watched them, questions piling on top of one another, with no answers in sight. How had she known to come here? Was it instinct or something more? He thought of the gifts she'd left, the moments by the stream, the way she had met his gaze as if there was more behind those amber eyes than anyone dared imagine. When dawn broke, the storm began to subside, leaving the forest wrapped in a heavy, glittering silence. John cracked the garage door open, letting in a sliver of pale light. The mother bear rose slowly, her movements stiff but purposeful. She nudged her cubs awake, licking their faces until they stirred, their small bodies still weak but alive. John watched as she guided them toward the open door, pausing only once to look back at him. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, he felt a wave of something he couldn't quite name. Gratitude, understanding, perhaps even trust. Then she turned and led her cubs out into the snow, their forms disappearing into the trees as the sun climbed higher, painting the forest in hues of gold and white. For a long time, John stood there, the icy wind biting at his face, his thoughts a tangled web of awe and disbelief. Spring arrived slowly in Montana, with the snow retreating inch by inch, revealing the forest floor beneath. For John Carter, the thaw brought not just a change in the landscape, but a sense of renewal. The long, silent winter had given him time to reflect on the mother bear and her cubs. Though he hadn't seen them again since the night of the storm, their presence lingered in his thoughts. He replayed every detail of their desperate visit, questioning how such an encounter could have happened. Bears were wild creatures, untamed and unpredictable. Yet their behavior that night had defied everything he thought he understood. He wondered if he would ever see them again, or if they had vanished back into the wilderness, their lives brushing against his only for that fleeting moment. Life in the forest picked up with the warmer days. Rivers swelled with melting snow, animals emerged from their dens, and trails became passable once more. John returned to his routine, patrolling the park's vast expanse, repairing signs and keeping an eye out for hikers venturing too far off the beaten paths. Yet the bears never strayed far from his mind. Each time he spotted fresh tracks in the mud or caught a glimpse of movement in the trees, he felt a twinge of hope that it might be them. He had even taken to leaving small piles of berries or scraps near the edges of his cabin, just in case they returned. Weeks passed without incident, and John began to accept that the bears were gone for good. Perhaps that was for the best, he thought. Wild animals belonged in the wild, far from human interference. But even as he told himself this, he couldn't shake the feeling that their story wasn't over. The morning they returned began like any other. John had risen early, the golden light of dawn filtering through the trees as he sipped his coffee on the porch. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. He was lost in thought when the sound of snapping twigs pulled him back to the present. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the porch railing, but he didn't pick it up. He listened, his pulse quickening as the sounds grew closer. Then from the tree line, the mother bear emerged. She was larger now, her coat thick and glossy, her movements steady and deliberate. Behind her, the two cubs followed, no longer the fragile creatures he had seen struggling through the winter storm. They had grown considerably, their once wobbly legs now strong and sure. John froze, his breath caught in his chest as he watched them approach. The mother bear stopped a short distance from the cabin, her amber eyes locking onto his. There was no hesitation in her posture, no sign of aggression. She stood tall and calm, her cubs flanking her like a small procession. John set his coffee cup down slowly, rising to his feet with deliberate care. "You're back," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The mother bear huffed softly, her breath visible in the cool morning air. She stepped forward, her massive paws sinking into the damp ground, but stopped again before crossing the invisible line between the forest and his cabin. She seemed to wait, watching him as though gauging his reaction. John took a hesitant step forward, his boots creaking against the wooden planks of the porch. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his movements calm, his body language open. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." To his astonishment, the bear continued her slow approach, closing the distance between them until she stood just a few yards away. Her cubs lingered behind her, their wide eyes darting between their mother and John. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a dream. John resisted the urge to retreat, his instincts warring with the trust he had built through their earlier encounters. The mother bear lowered her head slightly, and for a moment, he thought she might turn and leave. Instead, she reached down and picked up something with her massive jaws, holding it carefully as she stepped even closer. It was a branch stripped of its bark and smooth from the elements, the same kind she had left on his porch before. She dropped it at his feet, then stepped back, her eyes never leaving his face. John stared at the offering, his mind racing to comprehend what he was witnessing. He crouched slowly, picking up the branch and turning it over in his hands. It wasn't just a stick. The end had been worn down to a blunt point, as though shaped by repeated scraping against a hard surface. It wasn't perfect, but it was unmistakably deliberate. The realization hit him like a wave. She had brought him something she had worked on, a gesture of connection, perhaps even communication. John rose to his feet, holding the branch aloft as he looked at the bear. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate for the moment. The bear huffed again, a deep, resonant sound that carried no malice. She turned to her cubs, nudging them forward with a gentle motion of her head. The larger cub hesitated but obeyed, padding cautiously toward John. It stopped a few feet away, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. The smaller cub soon joined, its curiosity outweighing its nerves. John knelt, lowering the branch to the ground as the cubs inched closer. They examined it briefly before returning to their mother's side, their youthful movements still tinged with the awkwardness of growing bodies. The mother bear watched John for a moment longer, then made a soft, rumbling noise that seemed to signal the end of their visit. She turned, guiding her cubs back toward the forest. John stood rooted in place, the branch still in his hands as he watched them disappear into the trees. The silence that followed felt almost sacred, the weight of what had just transpired settling over him like a blanket. In the days that followed, John found himself drawn to the branch, running his fingers over its surface and marveling at the intelligence it represented. He began to document the experience in his journal, detailing every moment of their encounters, every nuance of their behavior. He didn't know if the bears would return again, but their visits had already changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He felt a deeper connection to the wilderness than ever before, a sense of belonging that transcended his role as a ranger. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a mere observer of the natural world. He was part of it, woven into its intricate tapestry, his life forever touched by the extraordinary bond he had formed with the mother bear and her cubs.